Testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Slightly early today. Welcome. It's the 3rd of September, as one song goes. And we're doing distant data information. Continuing on with Alyssa Battistoni's Free Gifts, Capitalism, and the Politics of Nature, Chapter 4. And we're going to go to the heading on externalities. Which has a critical history. A pall over liberalism, Arthur Pigou, and the birth of the externality. The externality was first theorized as a distinct concept in the early 20th century by the British welfare economist Arthur C. Pigou. Writing, like Marx, from the vantage point of England's early and tumultuous industrialization, Pigou noted the problem that Marx had only glancingly acknowledged, that the production of commodities was often accompanied by unintentional and sometimes severe physical side effects. Pigou theorized this problem by way of novel methods in economics, namely the recently ascendant marginalist revolution of the 1870s, which sought to turn economics into a modern science of markets, footnote 26, dispensing with the idea that value had foundations inhering in some commensurable substance, be it labor for Ricardo or wheat for the physiocrats. Marginalists argued that value reflected the subjective judgments of personal utility as made by consumers. Value, in other words, emerges in the course of exchange rather than the course of production. The early 20th century welfare economics, to which Pigou was a contributor, sought to integrate these methodological insights with those of earlier utilitarian projects aimed at maximizing social well-being, with the goal of developing a truly scientific study of social welfare. Prices were crucial to this project. Money, welfare economists acknowledged, was not the only thing. Money was not the only thing that mattered in life, nor even in economics. Yet, as the influential English marginalist Alfred Marshall observed, it was the one convenient means of measuring human motive on a large scale. Note, of course, that other methods of measuring human motive have been attempted. Footnote 28. Money was, he admitted, a crude measure that failed to capture all elements of economic activity, a widely recognized difficulty first discussed in systematic detail by Pigou's classic text, The Economics of Welfare of 1920. Following Marshall, Pigou argued that assessments of economic welfare had to use, quote unquote, the measuring rod of money, even if some things were beyond its scope. Yet he also acknowledged that this method sometimes produced violent paradoxes wherein welfare and price diverged. Footnote 30. These paradoxes, stemming from disparities in use value and exchange value, were often related to, though not always identical with, instances where the public welfare diverged from the interests of private investors in realizing profits. Let me break here for a moment, and this is a property question we can get back to. Back to the text. Pigou describes such instances where prices failed to reflect the effects of production on society at large as external economies. Now, the valence of the external economy was not always negative. Sometimes private producers accidentally generate unpriced social benefits, as when people built private parks that improve the neighborhood air. This is a BFD in the 19th century and the turn of the 20th century. It's why, for example, cemeteries began to look like golf courses and the weird overlap of those two things, at least in the American context. Anyway, footnote 31, we will return to such cases in chapter 6. Pigue's central example, however, destined to become the textbook case of the externality, was a negative one. The factory with the smoky chimney. For a British economist in the early 20th century, smoke was an obvious example. Pigou cited the astonishing observation that in London, owing to the smoke, there's only 12% as much sunlight as is astronomically possible, and that one fog in 5 is directly caused by smoke alone, while all the fogs are befouled and prolonged by it. Footnote 32, note that in the current day, that's an issue in China because of coal, among other things. Back to the text. That smoke imposed literal costs on the community at large in injury to buildings and vegetables, expenses for washing clothes and cleaning rooms, expenses for the provision of extra artificial light, and in many other ways, which were not reflected in the costs to the factory owner. In such cases, Pigou argued, the pursuit of private wealth tended to diminish public welfare rather than increasing it. Externalities suggested, in other words, that private vices did not always produce public benefits. In some instances, it seemed that a market transaction could make those who are not party to it worse rather than better off. Fortunately, externalities seem to be relatively rare and easily rectified. Drawing on Smith, Pigou argued that where the market failed to secure social benefits, the state was justified in intervening to address the disparity. Although the precise cost of external effects was often difficult to assess, they could be estimated with reasonable accuracy and included in the price of relevant goods through a tax or a similar pricing mechanism imposed by the state. Footnote 35. For the next several decades, most economists followed Pigou's view of externalities as an instance of market failure in which markets failed to optimally allocate resources, albeit a negligible one that could be solved with minor adjustments. Externalities remained a footnote to the canons of price theory in this period. They appeared, in the words of one mid-century welfare economist, to be exceptional and unimportant. As post-war economic growth and material throughput skyrocketed, however, pollution problems emerged or accelerated across the industrialized world. Externalities suddenly began to appear ubiquitous and significant, and a concomitant economic literature exploded. So too did public concern about the harmful effects of industrial production. It was through pollution that the environment became visible, quite literally. Smog made air newly perceptible. Smog as smoke plus fog, right? Smog. Oil spills gave water an unnatural sheen. The mainstream environmental movements developed in large part in response to this novel political object, visible political object. Footnote 37. Next section, reciprocal conflict. Ronald Coase, C-O-A-S-E, and the problem of social cost. As pollution grew more politically significant, the prospect that externalities constituted a potentially systematic market failure began to seriously concern champions of free markets. And the emerging neoliberal economists of the Chicago and Virginia schools in particular. Note, of course, let me break here for a second, that's footnote 38, but let me note here, of course, there is a pressure from socialist economics that attack, monopoly capital. And so hence that wasn't to a free market person, any monopoly would be a kind of market failure, whatever. For many liberal thinkers, as we've seen, the market has offered a way to coordinate action through freely undertaken exchange rather than direct coercion or violence. For some, even a way to achieve the common good absent universal morality. Ha! Good luck with that. The idea that unintended consequences might be perverse, or even in Pagoo's terms, violent, fundamentally challenged that optimistic view, very liberal view. Pagoo's account of disparities between private and public well-being seemed to cast a smoggy pall over the happy Mandelvian marriage of the individual good and the common good. Footnote 39. Externalities were a problem, even for those who had abandoned faith in the common good altogether. By then, suspiciously totalitarian to many liberals, the prospect that many prices were missing outright cast doubt on Hayek's claim that a quote-unquote spontaneous order could be achieved through the coordinating mechanism of price. The externality was a problem, too, for the increasingly hegemonic view of markets as expressions of individual liberty. Partially because it's about price setting, and then there's sort of an agency issue underneath that, I think. Anyway, back to the text. Market freedom was premised on consensual exchange, and yet externalities imposed costs on people who had not consented to bear them. People forced to breathe particulate matter has not agreed to do so, nor were they compensated with a share of the benefits enjoyed by those who had generated it. Now, why was the non-consensual infringement on bodily autonomy acceptable where, say, forced labor was not? The externality suggested that exchange might consistently violate a liberal tenet as foundational as Mill's principle that people are free to act as they please as long as they cause no harm to others. Do no harm, right? Footnote 40. Neoliberal and libertarian thinkers took up the challenge of the externality in different ways. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, 1944, had famously argued that state planning would lead to the tyrannical imposition of some people's values over others. And even Hayek had followed Pagoo in granting the state a role in regulating the smoke and noise of factories. But if externalities were truly ubiquitous, they threatened to license a drastic extension of government and potentially severe restrictions on market freedom. Robert Nozick would struggle in his text, Anarchy, State, and Utopia of 1974, to reconcile a moral framework organized around the inviolable Kantian individual with the fact that nearly all actions have effects extending beyond parties to a contract, some of which may harm others. Now, Nozick's entire argument for a minimal state, and note that this is a big deal for some people, the idea of a minimal or watchman, not that Nozick necessarily endorses that. Nozick's entire argument for a minimal state would ultimately rely on a complicated account of compensation for crossing boundaries, boundary crossing. In effect, a redescription of the problem of the externality, footnote 42. As complaints about the smoke nuisance intensified, Milton Friedman, Uncle Milty, similarly noted that, quote, there is no transaction between individuals that does not affect third parties to some extent, however trivial, so that there's literally no governmental intervention for which a case cannot be offered along these lines, close quote. The externality, Friedman worried, could therefore be used to justify a completely unlimited extension of government, footnote 44. As attention to the externality problem had grown, however, so had scrutiny of Pagoo's theory. Since the 1930s, economists had chipped away at the bases of welfare economics more broadly, in particular with the idea that social welfare could be calculated in the aggregate, that is, adopting in its place the far narrower standard of Pareto efficiency, because that fits the marginal model better. It numerically fits it better. In addition, in 1960, the British economist Ronald Coase launched a major direct critique of Pigou in his landmark article. This is truly a landmark article. Everyone should have read this, just regardless of your ideological position. The problem of social cost, footnote 46. Ronald Coase explicitly used the term social cost in place of the language of externality, which he thought too strongly associated with Pigou's justification of government intervention. Coase argued that Pigou had stated that certain private activities caused public injury. Just as a matter of fact, that when a factory's smoky chimney affected the surrounding air, for example, it constituted a clear, so to speak, clear case of social harm caused by the factory, which should be rectified by government intervention to limit the smoke. But Pigou's utilitarianism, he argued, had led him to import a moral framework that informed his assessment of both the necessity and the ends of state intervention. Pigou had imbued the positive science of economics with normative evaluation. This is a continuing problem. Let me break here for a second. The positivism versus, normative stuff is a big deal, and we'll come back to that in other yakking talks. Coase made three key moves in response. First, he argued that economic activities are not unidirectional, but reciprocal. Their effects always go in two directions. The smoke from the factory chimney, for example, would have harmful effects on health only if people chose to live nearby. So there's spatial and temporal element. Thus, both parties cause the damage. Footnote 48. Conversely, to limit smoke, as Pigou proposed, would impose a cost on the factory owner in the form of reduced production. Footnote 49. Why, Coase asks, should the factory have to accept the costs of reducing smoke for the benefit of the neighborhood? Why, instead, should nearby residents not pay the factory to reduce the smoke or just move away from the area altogether? Economists could not answer these questions, Coase argued, without imposing moral judgments inappropriate to a technical field. They could speak only to whether the value of clean air, assessed in economic terms, was greater or less than the value of the product that had generated the smoke, as if it were a nice, frictionless market. Second, following from this point, Coase argued that in highlighting the disparity between public welfare and private profit, Pigou had identified the wrong problem altogether. Only the total social product, computed by weighing the gains of preventing a given activity compared with those of allowing it to continue, was relevant. The goal was to, quote, secure the optimum amount of smoke pollution, close quote, defined as the, quote, amount that will maximize the value of production. So production is always, trumps, social costs, close quote, footnote 51. Finally, the mere fact that some externalities were uncompensated was not in itself a sufficient argument for state intervention. State action, whether in the form of taxes or regulation, came with, quote unquote, transaction costs of its own, which might be more significant than those of either doing nothing at all or leaving the interested parties to work it out for themselves. Footnote 32, transaction costs are a major deal in the second half of the 20th century. In instances where state action was warranted, moreover, the blunt and inefficient tools of taxation and regulation were not the only option. Instead, Coase argued that the right to do something which has a harmful effect, such as the creation of smoke, noise, smells, etc., is also a factor of production. That is, the state should assign rights to these activities as it did to other factors of production and allow private individuals to work out the value of stuff like smoke for themselves, the value of smokeless air for themselves. Footnote 54. Rights, in other words, could be allocated by markets, just like any other good. Now, you see, this is an important element because once you begin to think of rights within the context of markets, you automatically, well, with all due respect, Think of it as a commodity. Anyway, back to the text. If a producer wanted to generate smoke, they could simply pay the person harmed for the privilege or vice versa. Regardless of who initially owned the rights, Coase argued they would be allocated in whatever way maximize the total value of production. So it's all it's a little set of trade-offs. It isn't because, reality, goes beyond two dimensions in this particular context. Anyway, back to the text. The impeccable logic of pollution. Ronald Coase's was hardly the final word. Externalities would become a central concept in a vast literature on public goods and common pool goods, as well as in the emerging fields of environmental and ecological economics, footnote 56. But his analysis was rapidly embraced as a response to the framework of market failure, becoming one of the most cited legal papers of all time. Now, simplified by Chicago School economist George Stigler as the quote-unquote Coase theorem, it would become the far-reaching basis for a new approach to externalities and a pillar of the novel law and economics framework, which sought to apply economics to the analysis of law. Now, it reflected the vision of markets that had become prominent in the late 20th century, which had banished measures of social welfare, except insofar as it shakes out in competitive markets. That is, quote unquote, total value production as Pareto efficient outcome. Now, it reflected, too, the basic principles of market freedom as articulated by Hayek, that people should be able to choose what level of pollution they're willing to tolerate. Now, treating the right to pollute as a commodity would simply allow people to make choices that more accurately reflected how much they valued clean air or quiet or some other thing. The Coase theorem, capitalized, and the broader law and economics project have come under significant criticism for promoting an economic imperialism that treats markets as a solution to every problem. This is this undergirds some elements of antitrust law. Footnote 58. Many moral and political philosophers have charged that this way of thinking wrongly seeks to apply economic analysis to quote unquote spheres that are appropriately governed by other values and norms. What are those? Anyway, footnote 59. Pollution, it's often argued, isn't the kind of thing we should buy and sell. Michael Sandel, for example, argues that paying for the right to pollute is troubling insofar as it suggests that there's nothing morally wrong with pollution, that it is simply the cost of doing business like wages, benefit, and rent. While Elizabeth Anderson claims that environmental goods are not properly regarded as commodities, footnote 60. Rather than simply condemning the Coasean approach, however, that is Alyssa, is interested in what it reveals. For Coase is a perceptive analysis of the externality than is a more perceptive analysis of the externality than Pigou. Now, he's right that Pigou's analysis relies on an unspoken and unjustified moral framework. To know that the market has failed to achieve optimal welfare, one must know what the optimal welfare is. To correct prices, a benevolent administrator or a moral philosopher must know what they ought to be. Coase is right, too, that social costs are reciprocal and antagonistic, that one person's harm is another's benefit. And he's right to argue that harms, like pollution, are effectively factors of production insofar as the transformation of some materials into new forms inevitably produces surplus matter. And you can see that in the energy industry. He is right, in other words, that Pigou and his followers take the meaning of social costs for granted and arbitrarily apply a normative standard to pollution, one that they typically do not apply to other kinds of goods that just doesn't hold. Pollution, after all, is produced by the same process that produces standard commodities like cars and televisions, goods that most moral critics seem to think are legitimately bought and sold. You can see where that can go wrong when you think about automobiles versus guns. Well, anyway, footnote 61. tend to miss the actual causes. Critiques of markets that fixate on the trade in pollution or waste alone tend to miss the actual causes of most pollution, not markets in pollution per se, but markets in ordinary commodities, not trade in toxic waste, but the more basic principles of free trade. In turn, if environmental goods and bads are continuous with the other kinds, critique must not focus on exceptions to the rule, but on the rule of the market itself. So you can see where it's a question of boundaries, right? Some are presumed, you don't have to necessarily go past the limit, but it's probably a good idea. It's probably a good idea. Now, this is illustrated by a reductio ad absurdum. This is the Larry Summers here is the same Larry Summers of Harvard and a bunch of other not so good ideas. Larry Summers' notorious defense in a 1991 World Bank memo of the impeccable economic logic of dumping a load of toxic waste in low-wage countries, especially those in Africa. Footnote 62. Summers was widely castigated for his remarks, which seemed to many to illustrate what David Pello calls the racist and classist culture and ideology of Northern institutions. Footnote 63. It's probably why Larry doesn't have a Nobel Prize. But anyway, the problem with the memo, however, is not only cultural or ideological. Repugnant though it may be, the economic logic is impeccable on its own terms. It is the basic logic of free trade, of market freedom. The memo itself noted as much, concluding that any objections to its argument could be turned around and used more or less efficiently against every bank proposal for liberalization, footnote 64. Indeed, although the memo is often discussed as if it advocated a trade in toxic waste per se, it advocated something more basic, that is, the migration of dirty industries to less developed countries. It recognized, in other words, that pollution typically accompanies production. 2 decades prior, Milton Friedman had made the same argument in less incendiary terms. That is, nations could choose the pollution levels they found acceptable, he claimed, such that a higher tolerance for pollution could be a comparative advantage, footnote 65. As Friedman asks, if Japan chooses to subsidize the export of clean air to the United States, why should we object? Footnote 66. Or as Summers might have it, if African countries want to import visibility impairing particulates and export pretty air to wealthier countries, why should we object? Why, in other words, should we object if some people choose to accept the costs associated with production in order to realize the benefits? After all, this is precisely the trade that many developing countries have made in the years since. This resembles cap and trade, for example, or carbon trading, but that's another story. The most obvious objection is that articulated by Deborah Satz. Satz recognizes that pollution is not itself a distinct kind of good and is rightly skeptical of moral frameworks that attempt to delineate the limits of markets on the basis of the inherent meaning that goods are said to have. She objects to the trade in toxic waste on different grounds, deeming it a prime example of a quote-unquote noxious market, that is, one characterized by severe inequality between bargaining parties, as a result of which some are likely to suffer serious harms, like nuclear waste, for example. Noxious market charges limit the ability of people to interact as equals, footnote 67. We should, I think, be troubled by the noxiousness of these markets, but we should be especially troubled by how many markets turn out to be noxious ones. The severe inequality that concerns Satz is, in fact, the norm rather than the exception. It is the constitutive basis of class society itself. This is the problem of thinking of an externality as a excludability, and that's not the same. Contra Sandel, then, Pollution and social costs are part of the cost of doing business and should be seen as of a piece with wages and rent, which is to say, understood as expressions of capitalism's core dynamics and as corresponding sites of political struggle. Externalities reflect precisely the disconnect between intention and consequence at the heart of market rule, and the disparity in power at the heart of class rule. They therefore open up much larger questions about the organization of political economy than is typically acknowledged. Footnote 68. Next section. Now, the social costs of doing business, the violent paradoxes of market rule. We can approach the role of market rule in the problem of social problem of social costs by way of a body of philosophical work focused on allocating responsibility for climate change. Not because this literature attends to the market, but because it generally doesn't attend to the market. Footnote 69. Within moral philosophy, climate change is often said to pose significant challenges to traditional accounts of responsibility and moral agency. It is caused by the actions of such a large and diffuse number of people that any individual's contribution seems impossible to parse. That is, agency is, in Stephen Gardner's terms, fragmented. Footnote 70. The effect of each individual's action is so small that it seems to escape responsibility, yet taken collectively, in the aggregate, the results are catastrophic. Climate change seems even to reveal what Judith Lichtenberg describes as, quote unquote, new harms, footnote 71. Once, she suggests, we could recognize the actions that caused injury and seek to avoid them. But when our most mundane activities turn out to contribute to serious problems, she observes, not harming people turns out to be difficult and to require our undivided attention. Footnote 72. It requires reevaluation of our seemingly trivial choices: what we eat, where we live, how we get around, what we wear. Although any person's contribution to a problem like climate change may be negligible to the point of being imperceptible, most philosophers argue that to ignore the aggregated effects of our individual actions is to make what Derek Parfit calls mistakes in moral mathematics. Footnote 73. We each have a duty to face our contributions to the problem and minimize actions that, when combined, add up to a serious harm. Tellingly, in these discussions, action almost amounts to consumption. iPhones, flights, steaks, SUVs. As Lichtenberg puts it bluntly, every bite we eat, every purchase we make, footnote 74, rather than constituting a source of new harms, then climate changes simply shed new light on an existing class of harms, those already embedded in the in our market choices, if only by exclusion from them. Yet, in this literature, the market itself is almost never addressed explicitly. The link between consumption and harm, cause and effect, is framed as a direct one. Now, while such claims aim to clarify responsibility, however, they paradoxically tend to obscure rather than illuminate the structures of action. Insofar as their moral immediacy is achieved by eliminating the essential mediating institution. It's important, in other words, that the harms that result from our purchases are not the same as we enact on others directly. So there's a dissonance, I suppose you could call that, at least a dissonance in choice. Next, back to the text. The theorists of moral agency and climate change often emphasize the difficulty of knowing how to act rightly. That is, avoiding complicity seems to require an immense amount of research about everything that we buy. But as we've seen, epistemic problems are not exceptional, but simply endemic to markets. By their very nature, markets systematically make the effects of our consumption opaque to us. For the most part, we have no real way of knowing what kinds of noxious matter are generated as byproducts of the commodities we buy. We may be aware of certain, high-profile examples, the carbon emissions associated with flying, or the deforestation associated with raising beef cattle, but there are countless others we don't take into account because we do not, cannot, and most importantly, are not expected to know that they occur. This is like the degassing of plastics, for example. It is not a problem, comma, according to the theory of market freedom, that we don't know these things. To the contrary, it's a boon. Occasionally, it may be necessary to correct missing information, though there is, as ecological economists have often pointed out, something fantastical about the prospect of internalizing all externalities, as if the market could provide a one-to-one model of the world in its entirety, down to the last carbon molecule. Now, we'll look more closely in Chapter 6 at the challenges that arise in efforts to fix the market's epistemic problems by creating novel property rights. But the more fundamental problem for those who seek to achieve morally correct consumption is that market coordination is premised on our ignorance. Perhaps the most significant difficulty for those concerned with moral responsibility is that market choices, especially those made under conditions of market dependence and competition, operate within a framework that fundamentally denies it. The point of market freedom, after all, is that we aren't responsible for the effects of our purchases on others. Indeed, as Eric McGilvray argues, quote, market prices themselves are externalities, close quote, insofar as all prices impose costs and confer benefits on third parties in ways that no one, least of all the affected people themselves, can predict or control. Footnote 75. The externality, in other words, is not an error or an absence in the market, but rather an extreme example of how markets normally function and what they are supposed to do. This problem, of course, is the one that we've examined in Chapter 2, that of Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons and Sartre's counter-finality. It stems from choices that become problems only in the aggregate, from the way our action comes to appear as other to us, and the way that this estrangement from our action is reflected in physical form. Like Sartre's peasants, we're helplessly producing the floods that will destroy us and also producing the floods that will destroy others, just as the peasants accidentally flood the densely inhabited plains below. Our millions of tiny, insignificant actions are channeled by market rule and unified by the atmosphere. Although the philosophical debate has focused on the complicity of individual consumers, however, the force of market rule is most significant at the level of investment and production. Here, too, the Summers memo is illustrative. It describes how market rule drives capital to locate production wherever costs are lowest, which often means places where social costs can be imposed on others most cheaply and easily. So-called less developed countries stand in the same relation relative to private investors that individual laborers do relative to potential employers. That is, they're in need of resources that others control and must compete with others to obtain them. In other words, individual laborers stand in a position of seriality relative to those with the power to invest, to employ, to generate needed goods and revenue. Market prices do contain information. I don't think that was controversial necessarily, but anyway. But the information they contain is as much about the balance of power within a society as anything else. For what price are you willing to accept the burden of pollution, toxic waste, dirty air? The answer will depend, of course, on your circumstances relative to those of others. On account of social costs, therefore, needs an account of class power and class rule. Next section, obscure residues. Social costs are reciprocal and antagonistic, as Coase argues, but the struggle over the burden of social costs is better characterized in terms of struggle between classes with disparate power than as a market exchange between equal individuals. In turn, if pollution constitutes an unpaid factor of production, it is one that is typically appropriated by capital. These are the central insights of a less known 20th century theorist of the externality, that is the German economist K.W. Kapp, K-A-P-P, an institutionalist informed by the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Footnote 76. In The Social Costs of Private Enterprise of 1950, Kopp described not only the widespread affluence typically thought to characterize the post-war period, right, the Great Acceleration, but an economy plagued by workplace injury, polluted air and water, depleted plant and animal resources, and mounting waste. All, he charged, were costs of production paid not by private industry, but by society. Footnote 77. Entire industries were profitable only because they had managed, quote, to shift a substantial part of these costs to other persons and the community at large. Footnote 78. Kopp thought cost shifting more pervasive than labor exploitation, to the point that capitalism was not a font of abundance, but an economy of unpaid costs. Footnote 79. In turn, social costs were a site of political conflict. Private enterprise pushed costs onto society, and society pushed back. Footnote 80. While Kopp framed this struggle in the Polanyian terms of the conflict between private enterprise and society, quote unquote, I understand it, that is, Alyssa understands it, in terms of class rule, the ability of a subset of people to remake the world by virtue of the resources they control. In the course of commodity production, raw materials are altered in composition and structure, and as we've seen, there's always an excess. While Chapter 3 considered types of production that resist real subsumption altogether, supra-subsumption also persists in the really subsumed factory in the form of surplus matter cast off in the course of production. As capitalism has created colossal productive forces and even entirely novel kinds of matter, it has also created colossal amounts of surplus matter, and this too often takes unprecedented forms. Think of what, silly putty, or anyway. For an illustration, let's think back to Le Champ du Styrien's documentation of the production of a plastic bowl. Strikingly, the film concludes with images of smoke billowing forth from giant vents. Oil and coal both went up in smoke when that first chemist had the brilliant idea of turning these clouds into countless useful objects, the narrator observes. Into new materials were these obscure residues thus transformed, footnote 81. And yet, while the film follows the conversion of hydrocarbons into plastics, it doesn't follow the obscure residues that emerge from the production process in its own right. Plastics are the material of the Great Acceleration, that is, fully synthetic configurations of matter that had never existed before the 20th century, which were barely used before 1941, and which now are found in every crevice of the earth. As a class of good, plastics were molded for industrial production from the start. The field of chemical engineering developed in the shadow of Taylorism, oriented in its very precepts towards achieving a continuous flow of production, footnote 82. Plastics are economically viable only at industrial scale, moreover, because the initial molds are pretty expensive. It's profitable to produce plastics only in vast quantities, at which point they become drastically cheaper than nearly anything else. Footnote 83. Plastics, then, appear the pinnacle of real subsumption. Yet, they also reflect the persistence of suprasubsumption, the persistence of supersumption. Even these perfectly molded and moldable materials leave traces in their wake, and the residues of plastic production are no longer obscure. The petrochemical industry has for decades been the target of environmental literature and environmental justice organizing, from Carson's Silent Spring and Commoner's Closing Circle to protests in Louisiana's Cancer Alley and challenges by the Oil, Atomic, and Chemical Workers Union. Footnote 84. Now, perhaps more concerning than the residues produced alongside plastics are plastic products themselves, which have become one of the most significant contemporary sources of pollution. The plastic bowl tracked in Le Champ du Sterine is plausibly now floating in the Pacific garbage patch. Footnote 85, as this example illustrates, the line between commodities and pollution is thin. And so too is the line between the power to produce commodities and the power to generate byproducts. Footnote 86. Class rule, then, rooted in the power to decide what to produce and how, reflects the power to decide not only which commodities to intentionally produce, but also which byproducts to generate in the course of rearranging new materials and labor processes, raw materials and labor processes into new forms. It is not only the power to command the labor of others within a given production process, but also the power to impose costs on those who stand outside the formal production process altogether. It is not only the ability to methodically remake non-human beings as factors of production, to reorder the bodies of cattle or the genetic structure of rice, but also the ability to remake and often chaotically disorder the basic ecological conditions in which countless species live. Class rule, in other words, consists in the power to produce the environment itself, the cubic tomato, maybe. Next section, expulsion and absorption. Certain aspects of class rule, as it pertains to surplus matter, are illuminated by analyses of workplace domination. When an employer purchases labor power, they gain the power to direct the workers' bodily capacities, including in ways that may prove damaging to them. The mine owner orders workers into the pit thick with coal dust. The owner of the steel mill directs workers to operate the furnace that discharges poisonous fumes. The factory owner decides, too, whether to install a smoke filter or institute safety procedures. Workers can agree only whether to take the job they're offered by comparison, right? Footnote 87. Consider here G.A. Cohen's example of a chemical company that offers jobs posing serious and known health risks. Footnote 88. Do the factory's workers freely choose these jobs, he asks, or are they forced to take them? Those who argue the latter emphasize the structural unfreedom of labor under capitalism. People need a job and usually have little choice about what it is. Those arguing the former tend to make a version of Friedman's argument. That is, if someone is willing to risk their health for a better wage, why should we stop them from doing so? If someone doesn't want to take a given job, they can look for another. They're not bound to any particular employer. Now, the fact that they face dismal options, or spatial temporal constraints or material hardships does not diminish their ability to choose among them. Footnote 89. Cohen concludes that the workers at once freely choosing the dangerous job and severely restricted in options. The worker needs a wage to survive in the in the near term, even at the potential cost to life in the long run. It may very well be that their best option is to take a health-threatening job while others are able to, quote, make money out of their relative lack of freedom, close quote. This, for Cohen, is the structure of proletarian unfreedom. Now, but the structure of proletarian unfreedom extends beyond the workplace and the work relation. Consider here a twist on Cohen's question. Are people who live next to factories with smoky chimneys forced to live there? Now, Coase would answer in the negative, claiming that people are legally free to live anywhere they can afford. Perhaps they've decided that they're willing to put up with some smoke to pay less in rent or to have a shorter commute to work, and this is their choice. Now, we're not yet at the point of life on Heinlein's Luna, after all, where even air has a cost, that is, everyone can breathe for free. It's clean air that's often costly. Pollution is matter that no one wants to buy, which instead people pay to avoid. It's not the same thing. Those who can't afford clean air must pay costs in natura. A theorist of environmental justice would rightly point out that those who live in the most polluted areas are almost always those who have the least power in society, and we might add in the labor market. They're those who must take the lowest paying jobs and thus the lowest cost apartments. The wealthy live in leafy neighborhoods upwind from industrial discharge. The poor next to the incinerators. Footnote 91. Often, these economic constraints are reinforced by political ones, as when states issue permits for waste disposal or dumping that burden certain groups in particular. And they're nearly always exacerbated by forms of direct domination, as reflected in, for example, patterns of racial segregation and legacies of colonialism. Footnote 92. The key point, however, is that this is not only a matter of maldistribution of harmful effects, it is also underpinned by a form of unfreedom in its own right. Now, the structure of unfreedom here lies in the inability to refuse costs imposed by others. It consists not only in being compelled to take a job that may come with outsized risks, but being forced to passively accept the effects of a production process over which one has no control. Footnote 93. Labor power, after all, is simply bodily capacity, the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in the physical form, the living personality of a human being. Footnote 94. Marx, as we've seen, is interested in how these capacities are loaned out for periods of time and how they're actively put to work in production. But if bodily capacities are activated to quote unquote produce use values, as Marx explores, so too are they activated when they are used as sinks, S-I-N-K-S, sinks for disuse values. There's use values and disuse values. Footnote 95. Whereas the value of the commodity is realized through exchange, the negative use value of byproduction is realized concretely, that is, in the bodies of those who encounter it. We can think of this exposure to surplus matter as absorption power. It too names the use of human bodily capacities in the course of production. The autonomous Marxist George Kafensis frames this use of bodily capacity as a form of labor. That is what he describes as the passive work of absorbing capital's wastes. Footnote 96. But it is precisely the passivity of absorption, in contrast to the activity of labor, that makes a crucial difference. It is what renders the contract unnecessary. Absorption power thus raises an issue unaddressed by labor-oriented theories of domination, namely, that it's far easier to expel surplus matter that affects others than it is to compel their labor. To use someone's labor power requires consensual exchange in some form, however constrained, because agency rests with the laborer. If you ask somebody to work without pay, they can refuse, provided, of course, that the law and the state will recognize and reinforce that refusal. In the case of expulsion, by contrast, the agency lies with the polluter. Let me pause for a second. I'll be back in a moment. We are back. The structure of unfreedom here lies in the inability to refuse costs imposed by others. It consists not only in being compelled to take a job that may come with outsized risks, but it being forced to passively accept the effects of a production process over which one has no control. Footnote 93. Labor power, after all, is simply bodily capacity. That is, quote, the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in the physical form, the living personality of a human being. Footnote 94. Marx, as we've seen, is interested in how these capacities are loaned out for periods of time and how they're actively put to work in production. But if bodily capacities are activated to, quote unquote, produce use values, as Marx explores, so too are they activated when they're used as sinks, S-I-N-K-S, for disused values. I repeated something, and I'm sorry. We're on page 135. Sorry, it's because I paused the thing. We're back at page 135. It's easy for capital to abdicate responsibility for byproduction. The ability to pollute lies with the polluter by default. And by default, it's available for free. The factory owner can dump toxins in the water or carbon in the air, whether or not they've obtained consent to do so. And so they can effectively treat others as a sink for particulate matter or chemical waste without their explicit consent. This is that whole business of environmental impact. Those exposed may protest, but they cannot refuse to breathe polluted air in the way that they can refuse to work. Nor can they refuse to experience a climate change-driven heat wave or a flash flood. Human absorption power effectively operates as a free gift of nature. Human absorption power effectively operates as a free gift of nature. In a social order in which one group of people enjoys institutionalized structural advantage over another, the ability to expel costlessly and non-consensually becomes a way that one group of people profits by interfering with the bodily autonomy of others. Now, shifting costs back is the next section. Coase's proposal to allocate the right to do something which has a harmful effect then appears more significant than he tends to admit. It amounts to a proposal to put absorption power on par with labor power as something that has to be voluntarily exchanged rather than simply appropriated. So, if those subjected to capital's expulsion of surplus matter could struggle around social costs or refuse them outright, the consequences for the organization of production might be considerable. That is, treating the right to pollute as a factor of production that must be paid for would seem to give society a tool in the struggle to shift costs back. Well, yes and no. If, as Kopp argues, many industries are profitable because they shift costs onto others, forcing them to pay their full costs would presumably drive many industries to drastically reorganize production or even cease it altogether. Well, that presumes many things. Footnote 98. Coase, of course, has nothing of the sort in mind. And now it doesn't matter who initially holds the right to pollute. He claims the relevant parties will simply negotiate an agreement that maximizes the total value of production, inclusive of any necessary compensation for harm. Footnote 99. One of these two ideas has to be wrong. Now, the key difference lies in the view of costs themselves. Kopp's claim that capitalism is objectively in deficit operates on the premise that there is a true cost to pay. That is, one that can capture the various in natura harms to human and non-human life. Footnote 100. For Coase, By contrast, there are no true costs. There are only the prices that parties negotiate. Kopp's argument then is vulnerable to the same critique of moral overreach that Coase had launched at Pagoo. That his conception of social costs imports a set of value judgments. Imagine, for example, that a state created a right to pollute and allocated it to residents of a neighborhood, such that an investor hoping to build a factory would have to negotiate acceptable levels of smoke exposure with everyone living in the vicinity. Now, equally, we could imagine that everyone were granted an alienable right. Equally, we could imagine that everyone were granted an alienable right to a clean environment that they could choose to sell. Footnote 101. If each person were paid the true cost of anticipated pollution, calculated in terms of lost wages, healthcare costs, shortened lifespan, and so on, the sum might well be staggering, as Kopp's own estimates suggest. But in reality, many people are likely to sell the right to pollute far less than its true costs. They might do so in ignorance, not understanding the likely long-term health effects, or they might be perfectly aware of the risks but need money immediately. Or they might worry that the factory will move down the road, over the border, around the world, to wherever someone will sell the right for less. When people who have nothing to sell but their labor power find that even that is not particularly valuable, they may decide that their competitive advantage lies in their willingness to accept particularly dangerous or dirty forms of production, precisely as Friedman and Summers suggest, footnote 102. This is especially true where people are subjected to other forms of domination. As the Summers memo well illustrates, class power is typically articulated in tandem with other social relations, most notably, in these cases, those of race and of nation. Footnote 103. In short, people might sell the right to pollute, the permission to someone else to impose the physical cost of production on their body more cheaply than they should, for precisely the same reasons that they might sell their labor cheaply. They are dependent on the market, on the market to obtain a livelihood. They own little else, and they relate to others primarily as competitors. Footnote 104. To see social costs as akin to wages means recognizing that, like wages, social costs will always reflect the inequalities and vulnerabilities that permeate class society. To identify the maldistribution of externalities as reflections of a class rule, conversely, might seem to miss something vital about the anomalous materiality of pollution, its amorphous quality, its diffusion, its ability to travel. Ulrich Beck, in his analysis of risk society, acknowledges that the risks produced in the modern age are distributed unevenly. The proletariat of the global risk society, he observes, settles beneath the smokestacks next to the refineries and chemical factories in the industrial centers of the third world. But he insists that risk is not fundamentally a class relation. Footnote 105. Everyone, eventually, is threatened by the risks generated by modern society. In Beck's term, smog is democratic. Footnote 106. Now, there is something to this. While the distribution of surplus matter is typically geographically concentrated in ways that map onto existing social inequalities, it also resists containment by contract and private property, but also by political borders and social categories. The chemical harms visited upon exploited migrant farm workers do eventually rebound upon wealthy consumers who ingest the fruits and vegetables that the former harvest, see strawberries. Acid rain caused by sulfur dioxide emissions does cross state and national borders. Traces of industrially produced chemicals can be found at the bottom of the ocean in the most remote points of the earth and in the blood of nearly every person living. See, microplastic. But Beck's claim mistakenly treats class as demography rather than as social relation. To indict class rule as a significant cause of those effects, that is, to locate class rule in the power over byproduction. The power over byproduction is not to say that the effects themselves are distributed as a function of class alone. To say that externalities must be read as the product of class rule and market rule is also not to blame or not to blunt their sheer material force or reduce them to merely social relations. To the contrary, it is to underscore how social relations, mediated through matter, take on a life of their own. Surplus matter circulates differently than commodities. It accumulates in inverse patterns to wealth. Although it often originates at the point of production, it rarely stays there. Once released into the world, it tends to travel, such that its effects may materialize far from the original site of generation. Temporally, too, physical effects of pollution often appear at a distance from their causes, such that industrial diseases tend to emerge in post-industrial times, long after factories close and jobs disappear. In natura, costs materialize in the form of smoky skies and extra brilliant sunsets, dead zones, and silent springs. They appear in black lung disease among coal miners and heightened cancer rates among farm workers exposed to pesticides, in children's asthma rates and differences in lifespan. In Manchester's working class of, quote, pale, emaciated, narrow-chested, hollow-eyed ghosts, weak, flabby, and lacking in all energy, footnote 108, these too are practico-actants. Practico-actants, that is, human action channeled by market rule and class rule made manifest at the level of both the body and the biosphere. Next section, no outside. So far, I've focused largely on social costs, understood as costs to people. But the ecological costs, those borne by non-human entities, are almost too vast to grasp. From an ecological perspective, the scope of the externality is almost infinite, precisely as Friedman had feared. The neoclassical assumption that a transaction can be contained to the parties into a contract appears delusional in a world where everything affects everything else. Now, what is really astonishing from this vantage point is the idea that the revolutions and the use of nature heralded by modernity's admirers could take place without any corresponding transformations of the broader natural world. The idea, for instance, that billions of tons of organic matter, representing millions of years of concentrated life, could be extracted from the depths of the earth and burned in a span of decades without any effect on the presently living planet. Footnote 109. The sheer amount of surplus matter unleashed on the world in the past 2 centuries has transformed the ways that many kinds of creatures live in it. Some of this matter is synthetic and novel, like the microplastics that now permeate even the deep reaches of the ocean and which do not decompose. But surplus matter is also altered energy flows and cellular structure, the molecular composition of air and chemical compositions of water, such that ostensibly organic materials take on new dimensions. Algae grow naturally in many bodies of water, for instance, but algal blooms, turbocharged by fertilizer intended for crops, can suffocate aquatic farms dependent on oxygenated water. Microbes long present in animal respiratory systems can, under abnormal weather conditions, multiply so drastically as to become deadly en masse. Indeed, the effects of surplus matter on non-humans are much stranger and often more ominous than we tend to imagine. They unsettle the question of what pollution is. If, as Douglas claims, pollution is always defined in relation to particular organizations of social life, then defining pollution in relation to various forms of ecological life opens up a dizzying array of possible answers. A bright white street light can be pollution to a bat that hunts in the dark. The rumble of a passing freighter can be pollution to a whale that communicates through song. If the monetary costs to human beings of surplus matter are often difficult to estimate and always imbued by social inequalities, the costs to non-human life are literally incalculable, at least in monetary terms. They appear only in natura almost never in a form that capital can see. Just as the human economy imports free goods from the natural economy, the ecological economist Herman Daly argues it also exports bads without having to pay for their absorption. Insects can't demand compensation for the decimation of their numbers by pesticides. Fish can't insist on payment for the decimation of their waters by fertilizer runoff. Even estimations of in natura costs are necessarily filtered through human assessments and perceptions, as we'll see in more detail in Chapter 6. If it is always logical for capital to impose social costs on the poor, as Joan Martinez Allier observes, it's more logical still to impose them on the natural world. Politicizing byproduction. The material traces of supersumption are often destructive, but they also have the potential to generate new forms of political collective. The classic example of the factory that spews smoke, for instance, creates a novel practico-actant, in the form of air pollution, and in turn creates a novel form of connection among those exposed to it. Footnote 112. The industrial factory is already a paradigmatic example of social labor. That is, capital brings individual workers together and coordinates their action, such that they work cooperatively even though they sell their labor individually. The surplus matter that the factory generates, that is, the smoke and effluent and chemicals and waste, also has a socializing effect outside the factory walls. As people are forced to bear the burden of private production, they are, in a sense, integrated into the production process and materially connected to others, if often against their will. The socialization of production, in other words, is also the socialization of byproduction, as in bypass, whatever. These effects are not only unifying, of course, they also expose glaring fault lines in vulnerability. The burden of surplus matter, as we've seen, is not evenly distributed. It is disproportionately borne by those subjected to other forms of domination, that is, racial oppression in particular, and can serve to reveal these social disparities. Footnote 114. Many dimensions of the latent collectives formed by novel material entities will clearly map onto existing social categories. But other dimensions of these collectives are heterogeneous and potentially surprising as the geographies and temporalities of surplus matter itself. When Sart's peasants deforest the mountain, for instance, the flooding that results destroys their own crops and threatens the valley below. By contrast, when cattle ranchers deforest the Amazon forest, they don't face an immediate threat to their own production, although they might eventually if they then overgraze the resulting pastures. But they do affect regional rainfall patterns and increase, however imperceptibly, the prospects of significant sea level rise, which threaten coastal dwellers worldwide. A factory that emits primarily sulfur dioxide might damage the health of people living within a given radius, but have no effect on those living a few miles away, while a factory that emits only carbon will have no immediate effects on nearby communities, but will affect in some small way the entire world long into the future. Footnote 115. Often, the temporalities of surplus matter are slow. The effects of material like PCBs, might generate a cancer cluster over decades. The effects of sea level rise resulting from melting ice caps will unfold over centuries, yet they can also be frighteningly fast. Industrial waste discharged into a reservoir might make people ill immediately, while algal blooms caused by fertilizer runoff can kill thousands of fish in a matter of days. The physical effects of byproduction also interact differently with the physicality of bodies themselves, their shape, size, genetic dispositions, composition, and even species. Indeed, byproduction often reveals uncanny resonances across species boundaries. After all, it's precisely the continuity between humans and non-humans that allows pollution to travel so widely, as thinkers from Rachel Carson to Winona LaDuke have emphasized. Now, to say that social relations are materially mediated often means that they're mediated by other life forms, footnote 116. As both Carson and LaDuke document, toxic waste almost often produces reproductive abnormalities and aberrations in humans and animals alike. Pregnant people and pregnant animals are more likely than others to accumulate and pass on toxins. The chemical agents in pesticides do not discriminate among the organisms socially categorized as quote unquote pests, which they are intended to kill, and the other organisms from songbirds to human farm workers that might encounter them. Contaminated aquifers disable both humans and animals in what Sonara Taylor describes as an expansive web of injury, footnote 118. People living near the beach in Miami are threatened by sea level rise, as are those living in the lowlands of Bangladesh. And so too are freshwater turtles whose pools are increasingly inundated with saltwater and monk seals that nest on Hawaii's low-lying beaches. Other echoes are uncannier still. The levels of chromium found in North Atlantic right whales are similar to those of factory workers engaged in metal plating processes. Because high levels of industrial contaminants accumulate in the fatty tissue of beluga whales, the blood of Inuit living in unindustrialized Greenland has levels of mercury and organochlorides on par with that of people living near mines in Latin America. Footnote 119. These collectives initially exist in seriality, that is, oriented toward and connected by the common threat posed by surplus matter, the smoke or the chemicals or the warming atmosphere. But organization can direct collective action towards its source. Grape and lettuce boycotts organized by the United Farm Workers, for example, drew attention to the shared vulnerability of both farm workers and consumers to the pesticides used in growing crops and sought to mobilize them in collective action against grape growers. Yet, as COP observed, and even Coase recognized, the producers of social costs tend to have the upper hand in these conflicts. Social costs are typically spread across large numbers of people, while benefits are concentrated amongst a smaller number of producers. Benefits are realized immediately, whereas costs are often slow to emerge. These are daunting challenges, but they're not of an entirely different order than those that confront more familiar labor struggles. Movements for environmental protection are not simply new social movements entirely distinct from class-based politics, has often been charged, nor instances of post-material politics concerned with values rather than interests, footnote 121. Rather, they are simply a different iteration of the same fundamental collective action problem, generated by the structure of market seriality, footnote 122. What movements against the expulsion of social costs lack are the political infrastructures that can sustain collective organization in confronting concentrated power. Now, although unions have occasionally challenged the imposition of social costs on workers, there are no trade unions for those who bear the burden of social costs, and more broadly, no pollutees' rights for those organizing against the expulsion of surplus matter, as there are labor rights for those struggling against exploitation in the production of surplus value. But there might be one counterintuitive place to start with is with the rights of nature. A union of the affected. The rights of nature are often understood as a defense of nature's intrinsic value against instrumental use, or an expression of quote unquote respect for nature. But the legal scholar, Christopher Stone's landmark text, Should Trees Have Standing, in multiple editions past 1972, originally posited the rights of nature as a legal form that might address the problem of social costs as articulated by Ronald Coase, footnote 123. We all, Stone argued, should have to pay for the full costs that our activities are imposing on society, yet He recognized that this ideal was rarely met with respect to the costs of pollution in particular, footnote 124. The central problem Stone recognized was the mismatch between dispersed costs and concentrated benefits, and the transaction costs of collective action for those burdened by the former, that is, dispersed costs. Footnote 125. If, say, the dumping of toxic chemicals into a lake caused a $100 worth of damage to each person living around the lake, the total social cost might be quite high. Yet, it would not make sense for any individual to seek damages, and it would likely be too troublesome to organize the group to demand collective payment. As long as those affected remained atomized, the polluter would continue to reap the concentrated benefits. Stone's ingenious solution came in the form of the personification of the environment itself. That is, if the lake itself were able to bring suit, this is a standing question, for total damages to those living around it, the collective action problem would be solved by allowing the lake itself to prove damages, he argued. We, quote, we in effect make the natural object through its guardian, a rural entity competent to gather up those fragmented and otherwise unrepresented damage claims by making the lake itself the focus of those damages and incorporating it, so to speak. The legal system can effectively take proof upon and confront the mill with a larger and more representative measure of the damages its pollution causes. Close quote. Footnote 126. The lake would effectively aggregate the interests of all human beings affected by its use, potentially even including those not represented in the market or by the law, like future generations, so that their claims against their shared antagonist, that is, this mill, could be more easily made. It would provide a vehicle for collective action among those affected by social costs. Stone's other crucial innovation was to take seriously the costs imposed upon non-humans themselves, including those with no economic value. He sought to face up to the death of eagles and inedible crabs, the suffering of sea lions, the loss from the face of the earth of species of commercially valueless birds. Footnote 127. There was no reason, he thought, that the environment's importance should be measured only as lost profits to someone else. Footnote 128. Stone extended Coase's reciprocity principle to include non-humans. In a case where someone wanted to build a mill on the river, for example, reciprocity would mean that the mill wants to harm the river, and the river, if we assume it wants to maintain its present environmental quality, wants to harm the mill. Footnote 129. A potential mill would degrade the quality of water and river life. Meanwhile, the preservation of the river would harm the mill's function, or perhaps preclude it from even being built altogether. There might be difficulties in determining what the river wants or how damages to it might be represented in terms of cost, but these could be addressed through creative estimates. Now, the key point was that legal rights granted to the lake or the river could potentially represent the interests of both humans and non-humans arrayed in opposition to the mill. Seen in this light, the rights of nature can orient attention towards the source of harm to the river, the mill, and more pertinently, its owner. Insofar as the mill and the river are at odds, in other words, the rights of nature are effectively rights asserted against capital. Instead of reifying a given natural entity as a discrete subject of transhistorical rights, then, the rights of nature framework might recognize the more than human, the more than human collectives that are brought into being by capital's transformation of the natural world. Footnote 130. Indeed, what Stone calls the rights of nature are better understood as multi-species collective bargaining rights, a legal instrument that gives members of a nascent collective constituted by surplus matter the right and ability to join forces, and that might help constitute something like a union of those subjected to byproduction. Footnote 131. The establishment of rights of nature in law is hardly sufficient to generate such a collective, of course, but it might more modestly provide a piece of the political infrastructure for contesting the imposition of surplus matter on humans and non-humans alike. Conclusion. Pollution beyond price. So, as the concept of the externality discloses, human action inevitably has consequences that reverberate through the material world in unexpected ways. We'll always have to decide how to measure and share in abundance and its byproducts, how to allocate necessary work and unavoidable waste. The intense difficulty of asserting responsibility in a world where our most mundane actions inevitably ripple outward with consequences that exceed our intent or control will remain. So too will the spatial difficulties of acting within bounded communities when the effects may have planetary repercussions and the temporal problem of actions and effects that span generations. Any form of social organization to come will have to deal with capitalism's byproducts, residuals in Andreas Volker's term, long into the future. The problem named by externalities, in other words, is genuinely challenging. The politics of social cost, considered collectively rather than individually, can help us think about how we might approach it. Coase is right that there are no true costs, correct prices, or objective values. And so, too, in the claim that the goal is not to eliminate pollution altogether, but to secure the optimum amount. Now, it's hard to imagine what eliminating pollution altogether would mean, or how we might act without at least some reverberations we don't intend. As Commoner reminds us, there is no such thing as a free gift, no action in the physical world that doesn't come paired with a reaction. The problem comes when the optimum amount of pollution and the appropriate level and distribution of social cost are decided largely as a function of value production under conditions of class and market role, articulated with other forms of domination, and when we organize our action in ways that resolutely sever the link between action and consequence. But in the same way that someone might willingly do an unpleasant or even dangerous job for the benefit of a community they felt was their own, someone might willingly accept certain risks for a project to which they were committed. This is the case even now. People are often ambivalent about doing dangerous or dirty work, taking pride in their contributions to society, even as they worry about the effects of their health on their health or the world around them. Social costs, then, must be seen as sites of politics. Not individualized consumer politics or Hayekian expressions of individual freedom, but collective judgments about what we value and what ends we want to achieve, refracted through conflicts across radical power imbalances. In this vein, to understand pollution in relation to unfreedom rather than sheer violence or distribution sets a demanding standard, but not a rigid one. It does not permit treating some communities as sacrifice zones or dumping grounds. At the same time, importantly, it does not prohibit any activity outright, even those with potentially harmful byproducts or effects. It instead poses a more foundational question for us to answer. That is, what might pollution even be in a society ordered by something other than price? Interesting rhetorical question. I added yet another one of Alyssa's videos of a talk she made or a panel she was on. We will go to chapter 5 tomorrow. I won't guarantee that we will get through it in time since I have to end exactly at 5. But let me thank you for your attention. I hope that you will consider these odd and strange matters that we looked at today in Alyssa Battistoni's new book, Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Natural. We've just been looking, we completed chapter 4. Tomorrow we shall look at chapter 5. And then on the weekend, we have something very different that we're sort of plodding through. And I perhaps will talk more about that tomorrow. Thank you very much. I'm now shutting off the live.